And we're in the home stretch now, right? We've got 5 weeks left until the end of our season, and I wanted to conclude our year together by returning to this wilderness theme that we've been going on about for basically the entire year. And so over the next 5 weeks, what I want to do is I want to look at each of the 4 Gospels and the wilderness path and wilderness questions they ask of us. And then for our season finale, I want to look at probably one of the most famous wilderness stories in all of Scripture, the Great Exodus. And so that's what we'll look at on our season finale. Should be lots of fun. But I want to start this morning with Matthew. And in Matthew, mountains are very, very prominent, as we'll see in a bit. The story, though, behind Matthew's gospel is incredibly fascinating to me. And I think if we understand the story behind why Matthew is writing this letter, I think it will help us, give us a new lens to see our faith. So that's what I want to sort of look at, is give us a little bit of a history tour this morning. And one of the things that's so prominent in the book of Matthew is this idea of the temple. It plays such a prominent role, it's almost become like a character in the book. Jesus almost plays the protagonist, the temple is the antagonist. And so, for instance, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is the one claiming he's greater than the temple. He's got authority over the temple. He predicts every stone of the temple is going to be taken down. He predicts if the temple is destroyed, he can rebuild it in 3 days. And at the climax of Matthew's story, there's a tidbit in Matthew that no other gospel records, and it's this portrait when Jesus dies of the temple veil being torn in two. The temple, you could say, is this major character in the Gospel of Matthew. But why? Why does it feature so prominently? Well, I want to give us a bit of a history of the Temple Mount. And I don't know, have any of you seen the show Drunk History? A few of you have. It's interesting. Because people find history a bit boring, there's this TV show. It's kind of fascinating. What they do is they get a celebrity really inebriated, and then they tell a history lesson. And it's kind of fascinating to watch, actually. They sort of act out scenes as the celebrity narrates it. So I've just had a few drinks this morning, and no, I'm kidding. No. Temple Mount, a history. I want to give us a history of what I think is probably the most hotly contested piece of real estate in the entire world. Of all pieces of land on planet Earth, there's no piece of land that has seen as much conflict and claims of ownership than in Jerusalem, this thing called Temple Mount. Now, if you were to travel there today to the spot, on it you would find, and this would be great if I could have some pictures this morning, you would find the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim shrine. It's the second most holy site in Islam, next to, of course, Mecca itself. And inside the Dome of the Rock is something really, really fascinating. It's called Foundation Rock. It's the precise spot, Jews believe, where Abraham took Isaac up on a mountain to sacrifice him. If you're a Muslim, you believe it's the precise spot where Abraham brought Ishmael up to sacrifice him. And it also happens to be the exact spot where the first and second Jewish temples stood. At Foundation Rock, which is inside the Dome of the Rock right now, it's believed that was where the Holy of Holies was in the first and second temple. It's believed that's right where the Ark of the Covenant stood, right on that rock. So you can start to understand why there's a bit of conflict over this piece of real estate. But if you go back all the way a couple thousand years, you realize Temple Mount was home to the Jewish temples, and it's built atop something called Mount Moriah. In the first century, this was the religious, political, financial heart of the Jewish faith. This was central to life itself. And it traces all the way back, as I mentioned, to Abraham. But following that, the Jews find themselves enslaved in Egypt. And after hundreds of years, they're liberated, right, by Moses. They make their way back in the wilderness for 40 years. They make their way back to the promised land. They come in, and eventually 1,000 years later, David comes to Jerusalem and starts building a city there. His son Solomon, of course, builds this immaculately huge, glorious, beautiful temple in the year 900 BCE. Now, over the centuries that followed, the Jewish people came to believe that Solomon's temple, the sacrifices that were offered there were quite literally, those were the things that guaranteed God's relationship with them. And so every single day, in the hour directly before dawn, a priest would go into the Holy of Holies in this temple and would offer prayers and would kill a young lamb and take that blood and sprinkle it over the Holy of Holies. And the whole Jewish faith depended on that prayer of the high priest every single morning in the hour before dawn. It was believed that this is where the Messiah would end up coming. And in the 6th century, of course, the Babylonians come in, overrun Jerusalem. They destroy large portions of the temple. They send many of these Jews into exile. They're deported. They're shipped off back to Babylon. This is where we get Boney M's song, right, By the Rivers of Babylon. I've never heard, I kind of like the song, but what a desecration of the song it is, because it's the most happy-go-lucky song. But it's this lament that we find, by the rivers of Babylon, I sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. They're remembering, we used to have this temple, we used to belong there, now we've been shipped out. Oh, it's this lament. And then, of course, 100 years later, Babylonians allow the Jews to return and start restoring this temple. It's fascinating. The book of Nehemiah in the Bible is the whole story of them restoring the temple. And it's interesting, if you're ever in a church and the pastor says, hey, we're going to study Nehemiah, look out, because he's about to ask you for money for the building project. It's going to happen. We're going to study Nehemiah, and we're also going to build a building. Hope you've got some money for that. Oh, it's fascinating. The whole story in Nehemiah is about them rebuilding, restoring this temple. And so then the same things happen over. Okay, we've got the practice again of the prayers, the blood. And in the 4th century, then Alexander the Great comes into Jerusalem, conquers the entire region. But Alexander the Great was wonderful. Let the Jews continue their worship. In fact, the first year of his reign, they loved him so much that every Jewish son in that first year of his reign was named Alexander. That would get really confusing after a while. A lot of Alexanders run around. But then 7 years later, he dies, and the whole kingdom is divided up between essentially these warlords, these regional kings, and they are harsh on the Jewish people. They ended a sort of a great period for the Jews, and it ended in what is called the Great Desolation, the Great Desecration. It was almost unfathomable to the Jewish people, because what they did is they took their own gods, they went into the Jewish temple, set up their own gods, and they turned the sacred courts into this like basketball gym. It was basically where they held athletic events, which doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but for the Jews of the day, it's like this is just absolutely the most unsacred thing you could possibly do. And of course, there's all this tension rising. And in the 2nd century BCE, the Maccabean brothers, they lead this Jewish revolt. They rescue the temple back from these sort of dictator warlords. It was ritually cleansed out, and an 8-day feast of rededication was held in 164. Within 20 years, they had established a whole state. The Jewish state was back in place. Back again were the prayers, sprinkling of the blood. And then, of course, not just 100 years later, in come the Romans. Capture Syria, capture Palestine, and an even more brutal occupation begins. But you have to understand, by this point in Jewish history, it's the same old story. We know exactly how it's going to play out. We're always getting conquered, and then somebody rises up, liberates us, the temple's restored, we go back to the way things are. I mean, the Jewish identity was so heavily wrapped up in the Exodus story. This idea that when we are put under captivity, when we are oppressed, eventually we're freed. And so you have to remember, at Passover time, the Jewish people would flock in the thousands towards Jerusalem. And every time this happens, if you are an occupier, if you are over top of these people, this makes you very nervous, because the Jews start telling stories about being liberated from captivity. In fact, 10 years before Jesus was born, there was this big revolt, and the Jews actually took back Jerusalem and were able to hold it for 50 days. Now, of course, ultimately Rome prevailed, a little show of might, but hundreds of Roman soldiers died, thousands of Jews died. Tensions were always high, and during the next 6 decades, the Jewish community, they continued building the temple, they restored it a little bit more, they added on an expansion to it, even under these harsh conditions of Rome. For the Jewish people, the temple was the heart of their faith. Their whole faith hinged on the temple being this permanent fixture in the world. I was actually looking up last night the oldest building in Canada. And actually, some went back to like 1693. I had no idea there were buildings around. That's like getting on close to 400 years old. That's like seriously old for us, right? For the Jewish people, this had been around the temple for 1,000 years. And for 2,000 years, it had been this holy site. It had always been there. And under this Roman oppression in the year 60, so this is after Jesus' life and ministry, uprisings were happening so regularly, everyone was feeling like a full-scale revolt was on the way. And so a new Roman emperor comes to power, Vespasian. And he's like, I'm going to deal with this problem once and for all. Throughout the last 1,000 years, this always happens. People take over Israel, there's a revolt, this needs to be dealt with, a permanent solution. And so on the exact date, to add insult to injury, the exact date that Babylon destroyed Solomon's great temple, Roman forces under General Titus, they arrive in Jerusalem in this massive show of power. And the troops march into Jerusalem and they completely level it. I mean, in virtually all of history, there's almost no parallel to this sort of destruction. I mean, for thousands of years, it's happened thousands of times that cities had been sacked and conquered, but not this. This was entirely different. This was total annihilation. The temple's high altar was completely smashed to tiny bits. The troops took down literally brick by brick. Not one brick stayed attached to the other. Took down every single brick of the Jewish temple. All of the temple authority, the priests, the scribes, their families, they were all executed on the spot. Emperor Vespasian wanted absolute certainty that this would be the end of this. And so every single article inside of the temple was burned and destroyed. Much of Jerusalem was sacked that day, but the temple was entirely different. Instructions were clear: no looting, nobody can loot a thing, no stealing anything, just completely annihilated. Every single brick taken down. All that was left after was a platform where the temple had once stood. And it's hard to sort of understand how devastating it was. I think the closest we could think of would be 9/11, but even that pales in comparison. Everything was absolutely devastated. And you have to understand the temple was the Jewish faith. And now it's completely gone. Temples simply ceased to exist. If you were in modern day Israel today, if you were to go to Jerusalem and you went to Dome of the Rock, about couple hundred meters to the west of that is something many of us know as the Wailing Wall. It's actually called the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. Many people think it's what survived at the temple. It's not actually part of the temple. That one piece of wall is part of the retaining wall that held the platform that the temple stood in place. And so even to this day, you'll see Orthodox Jews wailing, lamenting this total devastation. All that's left, the temple, or these ruins, this one little retaining wall. And so for the Jews of the first century, and remember at this time, the earliest Christians still considered themselves part of the Jewish faith. For them, the foundation of their faith had literally been deconstructed one piece at a time until nothing was left. Brick by brick, their faith had been taken apart and was gone. And when your faith is entirely deconstructed, the obvious question is, well, now what? And this is where I think this story in history has very interesting parallel for us. For the Jews of the day, their faith had been entirely deconstructed. They were left with this simple question: now what do we do? And I have a feeling that this precise question is one that many of us wrestle with today as well. Our faith, the faith we inherited, the one we grew up with, the faith we had that once seemed so certain, it's completely come undone. It's been completely dismantled, and it's like, well, now what? I had a very interesting thing like this happen to me this week. My dad, he built a shed in our backyard, and he's not here, is he? Okay. He's just, finesse is not his thing. He can build or tear stuff down. Finesse is not his thing. He built the shed. It was kind of crazy. And then we were just talking on Tuesday about our deck, which is a bit dangerous in the back there. It's not great for the kids. It's rotting away. And he's like, do you want to do something with that? Do you want to tear it down? I said, yeah, I think so. That's going to need to happen at some point. Let me think about that. I was up in my office. I came downstairs. Half of my deck was gone. I was, Well, he's like, oh, I thought you said you wanted it gone. We're like, well, I guess I have no choice now. Like, he is just an animal when it comes to tearing things apart. And so now I had to rent this bin. And within 2 days, he had completely taken apart our deck. Now that's all that's left there is this really old pile of dirt. And I actually discovered something about my house at the very back. I didn't realize because it was covered by the deck. There's actually a coal chute, an old coal chute. Our house is so old, they used to shovel the coal in through the back of the house, the coal burner. So there it is sitting there. But I literally have nothing left in my backyard. And I'm going, well, now what? And he's leaving June 1st, so he's not going to help me rebuild it. So I go on YouTube, and I'm like, all right, do it yourself, Brad. Do it yourself. So I'm typing in YouTube videos of how to build a deck or a patio back there, and I got about half hour in. I'm like, that's not going to work. Like, it looks so complicated. Oh, my goodness. Man, I have zero skills, so I was hoping maybe we could do a bit of a barn raising here. And, you guys want to come over and help me build my deck? No. I don't know what I'm going to do. I've got zero skills, and I'm left. The deck is gone, and it kind of seemed like a good idea, but like, now what? Now what? It's just going to be ugly back there for a long time.
Preach a good Nehemiah sermon.
A what?
Preach a good Nehemiah sermon.
That's right. Here we go. Next week. Nehemiah and how it relates to deck building. You know, I think it's the same for many of us faith-wise. We have deconstructed our faith to the point where there's little left. And a lot of us are left wondering, well, now what? What happens when your faith is deconstructed and you don't know how to rebuild? And it's interesting for the Jews of the day, for the Jews who survived, there was this massive run, this fleeing up to Antioch, which is a city north of Jerusalem. All the remaining Jews that survived at the time, they escaped up north. And they were reeling from complete annihilation, deconstruction of their faith. And in Antioch, the remnant there sort of divided themselves into 4 subgroups. And the reactions to the deconstruction of the day are so telling. I think in many ways they highlight our own sort of response to deconstruction. So you had this first subgroup, and they were like, this is the end. This was the apocalypse. They essentially became atheist Jews. It was like, it's done. Temple's gone. Our faith is gone. There's nothing left. This was essentially the apocalypse. Done. I think a lot of us can sometimes feel that way. Our faith gets to the point of deconstruction. We're like, well, I guess that's it. And then there was, of course, this Pharisee group, and that's why you see the Pharisees a lot in the book of Matthew. And the Pharisees were like, well, this is our fault that this happened. We all disobeyed God, and we didn't follow his ways, and look what happened. We got to clean up. We got to embark on some morality wars. And I think it's interesting. I think this sort of thing happens today. People look at the state of the church. Well, if we hadn't left God's ways, if we had remained faithful, this wouldn't be happening to the church. The church wouldn't be in decline. If we would just get our morality right, maybe things would turn around. A third group, this was possibly the largest, they were just practical about it. They said, theologians, let us know when you've got this figured out, what exactly is going on. We just got to put food on the table. Not really interested. I don't really care about faith right now. All I know is that I got to feed my kids. This is about the end of the world. So their sort of response was just this practical, what do I got to do to get through the day? And again, I think for many of us, when our faith becomes deconstructed, it's like, I don't care about theology, what's happening. I just got to get through the day. But then there was this fourth sect in the Jewish community known as the Messianic Jews, earliest form of the Christians. And it's to this small little sect that Matthew is writing his gospel. Matthew's writing his whole gospel to them, and he's speaking to their situation, a group of people whose faith has come undone. It's been thoroughly deconstructed. There's nothing left of it. What are they supposed to do? And it's interesting, when you read the Gospel of Matthew through these lenses, it starts to speak on an entirely different level. So I want to quickly point out 5 little aspects of Matthew that suddenly look very different to me after understanding the story behind Matthew. For instance, if you open your book of Matthew, did anyone read the full book of Matthew? You did? All right, a few. Well, but 75 minutes, that's about what it takes, eh? It's not easy to read the Gospel of Matthew because you open it up and the very first thing you encounter is this genealogy of names that are completely unfamiliar, and it feels very, very boring. And you go, what is this? Gospel opens, here's Jesus' genealogy, name after name after name, boring, boring, boring. And many of us, I think, have been talking, okay, well, this is the attempt, of course, to sort of tie Jesus' history to Abraham. But I think if you look at the people's story list, there's something much, much bigger going on here. I think what it did is this. For these Antioch Christians whose faith had been completely deconstructed, along comes this long line of people. And if you start looking at the history of the people in that list, what you begin to realize is that each of them had a story of loss. Their faith got confusing, deconstructed. And I think what Matthew's saying to these Antioch Christians is this: listen, from the beginning of time, God's people have suffered loss, disillusionment, deconstruction of their faith, confusion, times of darkness, doubt, times of disbelief. I think what Matthew's saying from the very get-go is this: you're not alone. Your situation is not unique. I know it might feel like you're the first generation of Jews to come along and your faith has been deconstructed. No, this has happened from the very beginning, right from Abraham, who was told, get up and leave this place. And to me, it's so incredibly telling. It starts right here because many of us probably don't relate at all to this lineage. We don't feel any sort of connection to the names listed there. But it still reminds those of us who feel like our faith is in a process of deconstruction, it reminds us we're not alone and we're not unique. This is the process. This happens regularly in stories of faith. It's happened since Abraham. And for those of us who are deconstructing our faith, find ourselves disillusioned, you're not alone. This is normal. It's been like this for thousands of years. And then the very next story is the story of Joseph, which is interesting. Matthew decides not to focus on Mary's story. He focuses on Joseph's dilemma. And think about Joseph's dilemma. Mary comes to him, I'm pregnant. Okay. Imagine how disillusioning this moment would have been. Engaged to be married. This woman is pregnant by something, not by him. And you could imagine his entire world falls apart. And it's interesting because initially what Joseph does is he's like, I'm going to do what Jews always do. I'm just going to follow my tradition. And my tradition simply says this: in situations like these, you simply ask the woman to go away quietly, divorce them quietly. That's how the tradition worked. That's how these situations have been dealt with forever. But then this angel of the Lord appears to him and says, no. We're gonna park tradition for a bit, and we're gonna go in a completely new and different way. Everything that Joseph had known about life and faith was being challenged, and he simply asked to trust this divine intuition on this one and set out on a different course. In times of deconstruction, our tradition, the normal answers, the normal way of things are just not going to work. God might be up to something new, and like Joseph, there are going to be times of uncertainty. We're probably going to risk being judged by others who are still within the tradition, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be a struggle. But Joseph is asked to follow this new path. And then, of course, you come to the Sermon on the Mount, and it's interesting because numerous times, I think it's about five or six, Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and what he says is this: you have heard this said, but I'm telling you something different. I'm telling you something different. And I think, again, what Matthew is saying is we're going to need some fresh perspective on faith if we're going to survive this deconstruction, if we're going to start rebuilding. And then there's, of course, the mountains. The mountains in the book of Matthew, which are really fascinating to me. Jesus' preferred place of teaching was mountains on mountainsides. Jesus always withdraws to mountains in the book of Matthew when he needs to pray and reorientate himself. Jesus has his transfiguration experience on a mountain. Jesus speaks of a coming apocalyptic disaster while on a mountain. And of course, the gospel ends with Jesus' ascension, which happens on a mountain. Which is intriguing to me because there's something about mountains that speak to us. They call to us, don't they? They fascinate us. Ever since I read John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, story of the Mount Everest disaster in 1996, I'm always following along with Mount Everest news. It's been a crazy 3 years up on Mount Everest. So 2 years ago, 2014, 12 people die in an avalanche. In 2015, before the season even began, 22 Sherpas were killed in an ice fall. And this year, the first year since it's reopened, they've already had 5 people die. And I go, what? Why? What is this call to climb mountains? What is it? And there's this strange thing. I think all of us can relate, not to necessarily climbing big mountains, but whenever we're in the mountains, there's this strange call to us. It's like across time and culture, people have felt almost a desire for permanence, right? And physical landscapes, I think they often reflect that desire within us. It's why we are overwhelmed by mountains, because I think they connote the eternal. They represent basic, unchanging security. And when you encounter a mountain, I think there's something humbling about it, because you stand there and you go, this thing has been around for millions of years before me, and it'll be around millions of years after I'm gone. Something about mountains that are inspiring because of their permanence and their stability. And I think the message that Matthew is trying to get across is this. Listen, underneath your deconstructed temples is something much more permanent. Because even today, underneath that temple where Dome Rock is, Mount Moriah is still standing there. I think Matthew's saying to these Antioch Christians, listen, your temple is gone, your faith is gone, it's crumbled, it's been deconstructed, but there's still a mountain there. There's still something steady to hold on to. Underneath the deconstructed temple of faith is an unmoving mountain. You might feel like there's nothing left, but if you look closer, there's still something there, something very solid and eternal. And it's interesting, it's no coincidence to me that the very last story in Matthew is Jesus on top of a mountain. He's about to ascend into the heavens. And the story's fascinating because Jesus is standing there, and the text in Matthew says, some of them worshipped, others doubted. And part of me is like, well, what were they doubting? He's standing right there. But it's a fascinating thing because Matthew's, again, picking up on this deconstruction thing. Some people weren't quite sure what to do. And Jesus' very last words are what? I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. And I think that was a powerful word to these Antioch Christians who had lost their faith. We might feel like we're alone. We might be in a place in our faith journey where we're actually not even sure we believe God exists. God might be dead in our minds. Our faith is empty. But the end of Matthew reminds us, even there, even then, Jesus has promised to be with us in all that. What does this mean for us? What I'm trying to get at this morning is this. Here's the thing. When you first, I think, start struggling with doubts and disenchantment, you enter into this phase of deconstruction. And you start sifting through and analyzing all the things that you believe, and you're sort of, the goal is, can I strip this down? Can I strip faith down to only the stuff that I really, really believe? And the trouble is this, the further you go down the path, by the time you're done, there's nothing left. You keep whittling faith down until eventually all that's left is sort of scraps on the floor. Brick by brick, like the Jewish temple, you start taking things apart, and eventually, sometimes there's very little, nothing left. But deconstruction is so important. And I think one of the lessons here is faith must go through the fires of deconstruction. In the words of Paul, when our faith was like a child, it talked like a child, it thought like a child, it reasoned like a child. Faith has to grow up, put childish things behind it, and that can be a painful experience. Because there's something really attractive about a childish faith. It's simpler, it's consoling, it's certain. To grow up in faith means to step into complexity, ambiguity, uncertainty, anxiety. And here's the thing, there's no going back. Once you've deconstructed, it's never the same. The reality is, once you start sort of asking questions of a certain kind about faith, those questions are always with you. There's no going back, and it's scary because the fear is, will the temple be totally gone? Fear is maybe the whole thing, brick by brick, is just going to fall apart on me. And yet the story of Matthew is, yeah, that's what happens. It's happened since Abraham. And during a season of deconstruction with faith, it can seem like there's not a whole lot there. Seem like there's not a whole lot left of your faith. This is why I think for a lot of people, this idea of religionless Christianity, right? The end of religion, Christianity without religion. I think it's so attractive to people because they're like, okay, great, maybe I can get rid of religion, whatever that looks like. Maybe I can streamline my faith, get rid of the religion part. Or I know some who want to believe in the Christian faith, the story without believing in God, who want to strip everything down. And you have a faith, at times you can end up having a faith that doesn't have a God and doesn't have a church. And so it's just you alone with all the doubts you have in your head. And I'm inclined to think this: when you get to this point, something has to happen. Many of us may be in this or currently in this exact spot. It's fine. It's a perfectly predictable spot to reach. I've been there myself, so there's no judgment on my part. I get it. My point is simply this: you can't stay there forever. Maybe some can. I think a lot of people do there for a very long time. I was in this spot for many years, but eventually a deconstructed faith, it becomes almost intolerable. Something's got to give. If you want to maintain a hold on faith, the season of deconstruction has to be followed by a season of reconstruction. And what I'd say this: I think a lot of doubting and disenchanted Christians never make the decision, and that's key. It's a decision. Never make the decision to start with the work of reconstruction. You're kind of like me, looking at the backyard going, I don't know. I don't even know how to start. But it's interesting. If you look at the lament psalms, they talk about these seasons of deconstruction, but it's followed by this season of reconstruction. A turn is made. Lament, doubt, disillusionment, they are ultimately followed eventually by praise, thanksgiving. At some point, doubting Christians have to force themselves to read all the way through the Psalms. We need to practice reconstruction. Or same goes with the prophets, right? The prophets, they rage so much. They're so angry, and they despair. But a steady diet I found of rage and despair, it's just too heavy. At some point, a turn has to be made. And the prophets, you see that eventually they get to grace and hope. I don't know, it's kind of like my taste in music. Like, I love Rage Against the Machine, one of my favorite bands of all time. Had a chance to see them, Maple Leaf Gardens. I remember when I was listening a steady diet of them, there came a point though where I'm like, I can't always listen to angry music. It just does weird things to my head. Or my brother Mike and I, we have this thing. We like really depressing music, so we have this thing we call Depress Fest. And what we do is we get together late at night, and it's basically who can find the more depressing song, and we just put on really dark music, and it's so beautiful and wonderful. But sometimes you gotta like wake up and you're like, oh my goodness, I need just Justin Bieber or something. I don't know. I need to get out of this headspace for a while. And I think what Matthew seems to be saying is this to this community that has lost its faith entirely. He's saying we have to rebuild. It's time to rebuild. We have to believe that underneath our deconstructed faith temples, there's still a permanent mountain. And we must make a commitment to not let our doubts and objections to faith become our certainties, because they can so easily. At a certain point, we have to check our doubts and cynicism at the door. The temple might be gone, but there's still a mountain underneath it. I think for all of us, the challenge is this: at a certain point, we have to choose to practice faith, and it means exactly what it sounds like. Practice faith and believing. This was the message of Matthew, and I think the 5 messages are fascinating and apply to us here. The first is this: we're not alone. I think it's easy to sometimes think that we're in a unique position here in history. We're not. It's always been this way for the way of people of faith. Your faith is deconstructed. You must eventually move into new and uncertain realms of faith. Like Joseph, I think it's going to mean leaving some traditions, some ideas, some stuff behind. And it might result in us being mocked by others, times of uncertainty, and it's going to be really, really hard. I think Jesus taught us in the Sermon on the Mount that we need to keep our eyes open for fresh perspectives. We've been told this, maybe there's a new understanding. And again, these mountains call. There's something more permanent. Strip your faith down to its very core, there's still something there. And when our faith has completely come apart, even then, I think Christ is beside us, walking with us, even if you don't believe in him. I think this is what it means to practice faith. And for the Nexus community here, I know there's some people who are like, oh, I've just started getting to know faith. I've never been to church here, and you might be like, this is a little bit weird hearing this then. I get it. But I think there's other of us here who've grown up in the church, we've been there for a long time, and we're starting to realize, you know what, as I've deconstructed, taken bricks away from my faith, I'm not sure how much is left. And I hope that Matthew's letter here can in some ways be a source of encouragement. Here at Nexus, we're all about deconstruction. You can deconstruct your faith all you want. You can be here and not believe a single thing. That's fine. This is a safe place for that. But we also are a people who want to get to a place where we start reconstructing, rebuilding. If you need time, you can stay there. But we must continually ask ourselves, what's the next thing? Where are we rebuilding? And trusting the whole time that Jesus will be our guide and move with us.